Hi, I'm Boris and this is a truck. More precisely, it's the M51A2 dump truck by AFV Club, and today I'm going to build it, paint it, load it up and make it dirty. I really like the look of the MERDC camouflage scheme, and what I love about it the most is the variations in colors and patterns. You can pretty much do everything, from a neat factory finish all the way to sloppily applied camo and a mix of spray painted and brushed on paints. The one thing I don't know is how to pronounce the damn thing, so I'm gonna call it MERDC. The truck's chassis comes in separate pieces from which you build the ladder frame, so I had to make sure it didn't end up warped. I have built a couple of AFV Club's trucks, and it's actually a load of fun to see the frame come together piece by piece. Usually I start from the front, in this case the winch assembly, and work my way to the back, checking if everything still lines up. Sometimes I find it easier to thread the smaller cross pieces into the completed frame so I can align them properly. There's a lot of small grab handles that go all over the chassis, and I usually attach them at the very end of that step, otherwise they'll just get knocked off. There's a lot of small raised ejector pin marks on the inside of the cab's doors and the dashboard, and the dump body sides need some filling. What I do is fill the seams and larger gaps with Tamiya putty, sand it flush once it's dried, and fill any remaining scratches and tiny holes with VMS Black Flexi CA glue. I like that stuff for its sanding properties, and the black color makes it easy to see how much I need to sand. The wheels come in two halves and need to be sanded once glued together. I wish AFV Club would mold them with some sag, but otherwise they're pretty nice. Next, the cab's interior needs to be built. That's an easy task, with the driver's seat being the most complex part. I masked the windscreen at this point, so I could paint the whole inside at once. I wanted the side windows rolled down, so I added a narrow strip of plastic art to the top ledge of the doors, where the window's top edge would stick out a bit. This kit really just needs some small improvements, which are easy to do. Drilling out the exhaust is one of them. The back of the chassis needs additional glad hands, the parts for which are actually in the kit, but not mentioned in the instructions. I also added two additional reflectors to the front of the dump body and weld lines from stretched sprue. The chains on the dump body come from LZ models, I think, and I glued them in place with VMS Flexi CA. What's usually missing on truck kits are all the brake lines and the wiring. I didn't try to add every single wire and instead focused on the ones most visible, like the air reservoirs and the fuel tanks. I like to use Plus Models LED wire for these, fixed in place with VMS Flexi CA and cleaned up with CA debonder. The real fun starts here, painting the truck in a summer verdant MERDC scheme. But first, everyone's favorite primer, Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Black. I'm using a Harder and Steamback Evolution with a 0.4mm nozzle and thin the surfacer with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. The dump body will end up pretty rusted on the inside, at least what will be visible. To start the rusting process, I sprayed Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 brown on the insides, followed by a cloudy pattern of Tamiya flat brown. I then added Tamiya desert yellow to the mix and created some more visual texture. The base color for the camo scheme is Federal Standard 34079, or forest green. I like using Mr. Color 309 for that, thinned with leveling thinner. I start with the cab interior and apply a cloudy pattern over the black base. Then I lighten the paint with a drop of Tamiya XF21 Sky and add some highlights. Instead of masking, I brush paint the seats cushions with live color olive drab, which takes multiple coats and is boring AF. The dashboard gets a lot of decals for the instrument dials and warning labels. I'm not a huge fan of AFV Club decals, they're pretty stiff, but with some Tamiya Mark Fit Strong they ended up working. And finally, the interior gets a pin wash with Abteilung 502 Starship filth, thinned with AK's odorless thinner. For these washes I prefer oils over enamels, because of the longer working time and the smooth finish. Before starting the camo painting, I applied 2 coats of AK's heavy chipping fluid to the inside of the dump body. Okay, here's my process for camouflage patterns. First, I like to work off a drawing or pictures to get a feel for what the pattern looks like. With MERDC, this is easy because you can find a lot of references on the internet. Then I draw the pattern on the model with a white pencil. That makes it easy to follow the pattern, and the pencil marks can be removed with water if you make a mistake. For soft-edged camouflage, I freehand the pattern using either a 0.2 or even a 0.4mm nozzle. It just depends on how tight the pattern I want. I will usually remove the air cap from the airbrush to get in closer to the model and have easier access to the needle if I have to clean the tip. Sometimes I'm amazed by my own stupidity. Knowing the MERDC patterns pretty well, I confidently grabbed the wrong paint for the lighter green. Looked a bit dark while spraying, but I know I'm right? Anyway, after accepting I might not be the crispest chip in the bag, I went back and resprayed the light green with Mr. Color H58 interior green. I used Tamiya XF65 Field Grey on the inside of the dump body. Thinned with X20A acrylic thinner, it creates a more fragile paint layer, which makes chipping a bit easier. Immediately after the paint had dried, I applied tap water and then started chipping, using a combination of old stiff brushes, toothpicks and an old airbrush needle. To check my progress, I dry off the water in between, using my airbrush as an air blower. For the tires I use Tamiya XF85 Rubber Black. Usually I don't find it necessary to mask off the wheel hubs, as the weathering later on will hide the transit between black and green anyway. After the black paint I added a mix of Tamiya Buff and German Grey to the tire walls to create some volume and also some pre-dusting. The secondary colors in the MERDC scheme are either sprayed on or applied with brushes. For that model I wanted to go with the brush painted look, so out come the acrylics. AK 3rd Gen NATO Black came first, thinned with tap water, and I started by painting the general pattern before refining the shape with 2 or 3 thin layers. The sand color took more effort, as the shapes are bigger and the light paint doesn't cover too well. I first applied the outline of each shape before filling it in, again using AK 3rd Gen acrylics. Sometimes it's easier to stipple the thin paint instead of brushing it on, and that also helps prevent visible brush strokes. So far the whole model looks a bit toy-like. Let's change that by creating more contrast and bringing out the details. I highlighted every bolt, nut and protruding edges with light green and sand paint, mostly live color acrylics. I can't remember which ones exactly I used, but the general idea is a lighter hue of the base color. Now the whole thing needs a couple of decals. I had to piece together the unit markings on the front bumper using perfect scale Modellbau decals. That's a bit tedious, but it gets easier if you gloss coat the surface where the decals will go. This is something I usually don't do before applying decals, but in this case it helps moving the tiny letters around. Some more detail painting on the exhaust. I used AK 3rd Gen graphite as a base color for the rusty and burnt pipe. To paint the reflectors, I start by applying live color acrylic sand and follow it up with Tamiya clear orange and clear red. After the detail painting, it's time for a pin wash, and I guess that's the biggest step in creating an interesting model. I used Abteilung 502 sepia, thinned with AK odorless thinner, and work my way across the details of the model. Often I find myself falling into a pattern, producing the same effect all across the surface, which is not ideal, so I try to alter my process ever so often, sometimes leaving the wash to dry before blending it, sometimes blending it right away, or spreading the wash with a thicker brush and a stippling motion. If I feel like it, I will also add random wear and dirt kind of spontaneously to avoid monotony in the finish. The fuel tanks get a heavier pin wash and grime accumulations at the same time, but I will come back to them later and add spilling and another layer of weathering. Chipping on this truck is mostly visible on the front bumper and on the side walls of the dump body. I started with AK 3rd Gen burnt umber, which is a nice base for rusty chips. I use a sponge and try to be subtle and focus on the edges, as my references show the trucks in pretty good condition. On the dump body I went a bit heavier, because it seemed logical to me and I wanted to create some contrast between the cab and the body. To add rust, I use Abteilung oil paints again, this time light rust and dark rust. A quick pin wash on the previously applied chips, and a more general wash on parts of the body, and all of that was blended with odorless thinner. Now for one of my favorite parts in the weathering process: pigments, fixer and an airbrush. I know it's a bit messy, but I absolutely love the result. I borrowed this idea from Mike Rinaldi and it goes like this. First, you apply pigments to the surface and spread them around. Then you mist pigment fixer using an airbrush. And by misting, I mean turning down the air pressure until the fixer barely comes out of your airbrush. It helps to have a matte surface so the pigments don't go flying away as soon as the airbrush hits them. And also to keep the surface you are working on roughly horizontal. This creates a dust and dirt effect with a bit of texture and a randomness that is kind of unique to this technique. And the texture also helps in the next step, which is oil and grease effects. With a mix of Abteilung sepia and ammo wet effects, you can really start to create a grimy, greasy mess that soaks into the pigment texture in certain places and gives a lot of interesting variation in sheen. Sometimes though, enamel effects have their use for me, like here, where I used ammo light matte effects as a wash to weather the tires. It's basically pigments and wash in one, so it can save you a bit of time. I wanted to fill the dump body with a proper load of earth and rubble, and I had no idea what I was doing. So I start by cutting a block of styrofoam, which I paint black with cheap household acrylic paint, to have a base that is lightweight and not pink, I guess. Once that's dry, I glue it to the bed using regular PVA glue, and then I can start adding the rubble, which I liberated from the park of a nearby military academy. I fix it in place with AK's gravel and sand fixer, and I work in a couple of layers until I'm happy. At the end, I add sand I sifted from the same rubble to soak up some of the fixer and to get some variety in the texture. The same sand goes on the sides of the dump body, as I guess some of the stuff would go everywhere when loading the truck. And again, I fix that with gravel and sand fixer, this time using a brush to apply it more precisely. The fixer can leave tight marks on the model, but these will quickly go away in the next step, pre-dusting. I mix Tamiya buff and sky gray to get a color close to the rubble I used and which will complement the green paint on the model. I apply it along the sides of the truck bed, around the chassis and all the places where dust might collect. I follow the pre-dusting with more oils, this time using sepia and buff in various mixing ratios. This process is very relaxing, and I switch between applying small amounts of oils, blending them in, stippling and moving them around. I usually have a collection of brushes next to me to achieve different looks and textures. There are no hard rules I follow, I just take a step back once in a while to see if I need to add or remove anything. Sometimes I even go back to applying a wash in an area or add more rust effects, like here on the dump body. Something I find interesting with the flat MERDC finishes is how many small speckles of dirt and grime you see in pictures. Speckling with thin Starship Filth oil paint is an easy way to replicate that, and I use different thinning ratios to get even more randomness. After this is done, I can finally remove the masking tape from the windshield. Always satisfying. One thing the kit does not give you is the clear plastic for the rear window inside the canvas. I used a piece of thin clear plastic sheet for that and attached it with PVA glue. The straps to tie up the canvas are made out of paper which I painted in a light olive drab before cutting it to size. I used tiny drops of thick CA glue to fix them in place, 3 longer ones and 2 short ones in between. For the dusty windshield, I cut masks from Tamiya tape and spray highly diluted Tamiya buff using very low pressure. It's almost like speckling, but with an airbrush. To soften the effect and get rid of excessive texture, I rub the glass parts with a cotton bud as soon as the paint starts drying. The truck is still missing some metal, so out comes the soft pencil. Here I focus on edges and the centers of larger rust chips, especially on the dump body. And finally, the exhaust gets an acrylic wash with various rust colors wet blended together, and then I work small amounts of black pigments into the still wet paint. Here you go! A used but not beaten dump truck in an interesting looking camo scheme, happily hauling huge heaps of hummus. Or dirt, whatever. I really like AFV Club's trucks, and I can't wait for the next MERDC camouflage project. Thank you so much for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, or if you simply enjoy pressing buttons, please consider leaving a like or a comment, subscribe, share. All of this would help me grow the channel and do more plastic silliness in the future. Thanks again, and I see you in the next video.